Thank you, Laurie. I appreciate everyone who has endured the week being here on an early Friday morning. I'll talk to you about NEHRP, a little bit about where we've been, and hopefully more about where I think we need to be going. It's an evolving story, which is an interesting one to talk about. The previous speaker talked about the social science and the political and societal aspects of this, and that's a big part of this. It's more than just the engineering and the seismology and everything. It's the human element to this. This is the traditional view of the earthquake problem with the U.S. This is the contiguous 48 states. I didn't forget about Alaska and Hawaii and Guam and Puerto Rico. But it's a broad problem. New Madrid in St. Louis and Memphis is the big thing in the middle. The West Coast is obviously at risk. The Rocky Mountain West. But it's a substantial problem, and we know that this exists. Perhaps a better look is the haywire scenario that just was launched, and that gives real life, tangible estimates on what would happen with a large earthquake in an urban setting. We've had this happen in Loma Prieta, we've had it happen in Northridge, we had it happen in Kobe. This is daunting because it's not a great earthquake, but we're looking at many hundreds of deaths, many thousands of injuries. 5% of the buildings would be unsafe, about 0.5% would collapse. The average building owner doesn't know that. $80 billion in damage, substantial impacts in one of the more important corridors in the United States. This shows the power of the scenario, and it also shows that the utilities, the lifelines, are very important to the process. So, historically, NEHRP is 40 years old. We currently have about $135 million a year that are spread around the four agencies. NIST is by far the stepchild of the four agencies in terms of budget. I won't gripe about that, but the power of NEHRP is that each agency has its own swim lane, and we complement one another. We work together, each brings its own strength to the table, and the system works. Could be funded to a higher degree, but the system works. Our focus is on buildings and lifelines, not bridges, not tsunamis, not any of this other stuff. The legislation is fairly specific. The NEHRP program arguably came out of San Fernando in 1971. And Congress, if you read the legislation, observed some things. That was that a large population of the country is at risk. Earthquakes have caused a lot of damage, and things could be made better by improved design and construction methods, land use controls, and redevelopment. I put this in for Lori. Prediction techniques were in the original bill, and we'll focus on early warning, coordinated emergency preparedness, and public education. I think we've done a pretty good job in these areas. Land use, furthermore, I don't expect you to read all this, but Congress in their wisdom said that an expertly staffed and adequately financed earthquake hazard reduction program would reduce the risk of loss, okay, in an amount far greater than the investment. We can we keep sending this message to our friends in Congress? An early warning system could produce significant benefits. The implementation of a NEHR program would reduce impacts of other hazards. You make something work better for earthquakes, you make it work better for other hazards as well as normal operation. We need to do a better job of technology transfer, and I think particularly FEMA does a really good job with this. The process has focused in large part on building codes and design practices. It started off on the left side here with ATC 306, which was funded by NSF and NIST, the National Bureau of Standards. FEMA took the ball, much to their credit, and has shepherded the process for developing new design provisions over the past intervening decades. So the NEHR provisions beget the ASCE 7, which in turn goes theoretically into the IBC. It's a large process. Each agency contributes to this. So if you like the USGS maps and their hazard tools, you're using NEHR. If you use ASCE 7, you're using NEHR. It's all in there together. So we're happy with this. I'll wave the NIST flag. We do a bunch of stuff. We do basic research into performance-based design. We've worked with all three of our partner agencies on things like the Memphis adoption of the IBC seismic provisions, which was an interesting experience. We've looked at developing tech briefs. Precast concrete diaphragms, that's an outgrowth of a big study that was done in response to Northridge. Things like looking at non-ductile concrete buildings, looking at response spectra, and a truly frightening thing, looking at deep, slender beam columns under simulated seismic performance. I'm not a steel guy, but this doesn't look to me to be really good behavior. We do a number of things in our role with the smallest budget in the program, so end of commercial. Earthquake engineering has substantially changed. We've gained a lot of knowledge about the seismology and the events that lead to shaking. We've substantially increased the catalog of recorded ground motions. We've got better materials, we've got better computational tools and hardware. Our design approach has evolved from prescriptive design to performance-based design, and practitioners can use nonlinear analysis, which is both good and a curse. NEHR, though, needs to evolve to address these things. Design for life safety remains the default design condition, except in special cases. Existing buildings are a serious issue. They're the elephant in the room that people are reluctant to talk about. LA and San Francisco get full marks for their aggressive adoption of ordinances regarding soft first story and non-ductile concrete buildings. The more recent thing is that lifelines, which go beyond buildings, are really essential for normalcy in the community. You can have a building that survives in pretty good shape, but if you don't have power and you don't have water, you're living in 1880 again, and that's the problem. Recent earthquakes around the world have showed that people have a very low tolerance for that. There's a time element in all of this. If you have an earthquake and you have 1,000 buildings that are damaged, you're going to have to queue up to get the engineers out there to do inspections. If the engineers are tied up and if the repair crews and all of the sundry materials you need, all of that delays operation, getting back to normal. So the NEHR world going forward has got to look at community resilience. I'm not going to read all this, but you know, it takes a community to operate a community, and it's more than just isolated buildings. We did a recent study at NIST, which was assigned to us by our benevolent friends in the U.S. Senate, that assigned us to look at the question of immediate occupancy. What kind of basic principles, research, implementation activities, all these things would be required to develop performance objectives for immediate occupancy across all natural hazards: wind, seismic, hurricanes, you know, everything known to man and woman, with all of the differences in design approaches and everything. So we've put this together. We've identified areas in building design, the community considerations, the economic and social aspects. How do you decide to do this? Who decides? Mandatory or voluntary? How do you get it adopted? You know, how does this happen? It just doesn't occur by itself. So we've got a report that's winding its way through review right now. Once this thing gets out, we'll spam the EERI membership. But it identifies the big ticket items that one would have to do. It's 120 some pages long. There's a lot of things to consider. A lot of it has to do with social and economic issues. Aspects of this are found in the current NEHR bill, Senate 1768, that Senator Feinstein introduced, and it's taken chapter and verse and put, you know, into the assignment from the Senate. So you can probably tell who was behind the immediate occupancy assignment that we got. So if and when the NEHR bill is passed, we're going to have to go in and officially do this with Mike Mahoney and our good friends at FEMA. So this, you know, this is somewhat coalescing. It's interesting. The study relates to AB 1857 that Representative Nazarian has been working on, that got a vote this past Tuesday in Sacramento. While his bill is a page long and just says go do it, our study looks behind the curtain on how one might do it and what all the issues are. The policy questions are gigantic in this. The future, I think, looks at life safety as the beginning of the conversation. I don't think it's sufficient. It's my own personal opinion. I don't think every building needs to be immediately occupiable, but I think we need to be headed towards a more robust building performance conversation. Social economic issues have got to inform this. The building function is critical. It's not just occupancy, it's building function. The FAA did a whole bunch of work that supported an executive order, and they had a big fight about some of their radar installations. And are those essential facilities or not? Well, they're not occupied. There's nobody there. There's radar. You know, well, but that's an essential facility. You need to have the ability to do your duty for the, you know, for the air traffic system. Existing buildings have got to be a priority, and we, for heaven's sake, got to be talking about lifelines. So what I'm doing is I'm saying there's in 40 years going forward, there's another new set of issues we need to look at. We've got an opportunity and a responsibility to evolve, and I am really, really excited about this. because I think we could declare victory that we've gotten the building codes for new stuff to a point where we've met our initial objectives. I think it's now time to set new objectives and to move the bar. So I'll end almost on time.
Thank you, Steve. We're going to hold questions till the end. Our next presenter is Julio Ramirez, who I introduced already. Talking about NERI and opportunities for natural hazards research to bolster community.
Good morning. Thank you first to the organizers, Lori and Chris and ERI, for the opportunity to share with you some information that I hope you'll find helpful in your various activities about NERI, the National Hazards Engineering Research Infrastructure. I am here representing it in my capacity as Director of the Network Coordination Office. NERI follows in the footsteps of the first of such research infrastructures, shared use research infrastructures, funded by the National Science Foundation for combating the impact of earthquakes and tsunamis on our civil infrastructure, the George E. Brown Jr. Network for Earthquake Engineering Simulation, also known as NEAS. Today, NERI is one of about 20 or so large-scale infrastructures funded by NSF throughout its various directorates. In my presentation, the first couple of slides will go to what is the motivation from the National Science Foundation and the US government to fund these kinds of infrastructures. First example, NEAS, followed now by, after 2016, NERI. And also, I will try to share with you some of the impact that such activities by the users of those infrastructures have had on improving the resilience of our civil infrastructure. First, NEAS throughout its 10 years of operations, followed by NERI. The motivation actually goes back to some work that was done in the 90s. ERI played a very important role where it was determined that the current state, the state at the time of the testing capabilities in the United States was lagging behind in order to properly address the challenges ahead to improve the resilience of our civil infrastructure against earthquakes and tsunamis. So initially, the George E. Brown Jr. Network for Earthquake Engineering Simulation consisted of a competition to improve testing capabilities. That was in the period of 2000 to 2004. As a result, 15 laboratories were commissioned. Those laboratories, some were new, built from scratch. Others were embedded inside existing, well-known testing facilities with a long-standing tradition for testing. After the commissioning of those 15 laboratories, which was done in an open competition, then NEAS was formed as a network of distributed facilities connected by cyber infrastructure. Such facilities have also capabilities required to answer the questions that researchers were seeking to improve the resilience of our infrastructure. Throughout 10 years, from 2004 to 2014, the NEAS was funded by the National Science Foundation, both on the operations side and on the research side. On the research side, the budget annual for, and it was focused on earthquake engineering research, was about $8 to $10 million. Basically, NSF viewed that as their contribution to the McCabe program that Steve just discussed. The outcome of those 10 years of operations is shown in this slide. In this slide, the metrics are, in my opinion, worth noting. Over 422 projects went through those 15 initially, and the last 5 years, 14 laboratories. There was a designated program for research. That's what it's called, the NIS-R research, the one I mentioned, the order of $8 to $10 million, which was to use those facilities. Those projects, about 80% were from facilities not the laboratories where the projects were conducted. And the distribution of the projects is shown in this slide. Also, in terms of workforce development, it was a very important aspect. Over 200 RUs went through the program in those 10 years. And the third component was a wealth of data resulting from those tests. By the end of the 10-year period, there were over 2 million data files and folders in the repository and the cyber infrastructure of NIS. When NERI was established, all that information was transferred to the new cyber infrastructure provider. I want to just highlight one example and also give you a reference for you to seek more information about the impact of the projects that went through NIS. This happens to be the non-ductile reinforced concrete project. It was a multi-year project. And one of the things that NIS provided that wasn't available before was the ability to test at scales that couldn't be done before, and also doing it at multiple facilities, and allowing through the cyber infrastructure that connected those laboratories, the sharing of that information between researchers. In some of the laboratories, testing at multiple facilities could be accomplished real time. And so this is just an example. There were full-scale tests conducted at least 5 or 6 different NIS laboratories that ranged from concrete columns to beam column joints with detailings pre-1970s. Also scale tests of frames and floor membranes, all looking to those triggers that lead to the collapse to those non-ductile concrete buildings. Again, the issue was not to see what all the buildings were safe, but to identify those that had because of how they were detailed, the propensity for collapse, and were called the killer buildings, which, by the way, is something that not only is prevalent or occurred in the United States, but is prevalent around the world, as we see by the information that comes out of those events. Specific contributions, the project team members led the development of revisions to the concrete revisions of ASCE SEI 41, and the test results and numerical simulations supported changes for updating provisions related to the seismic rehabilitation of reinforced concrete buildings. Now I'm going to take us to NERI in the balance of my talk. In 2016, this infrastructure, which was established with all its components, those are shown in this slide. It consisted of some of the laboratories that were already part of NIS through a open competition. They became laboratories in NERI, so focused on earthquake engineering. Although one of the characteristics of this new infrastructure is that it's multi-hazard. It focuses on 2 types of natural hazards: earthquakes and associated tsunami, windstorms and associated storm surge problems in coastal areas. Additions to the testing capabilities for seismic concerns were wind laboratories, and also another important component was an emphasis on simulation. And that's one of the key aspects, the new aspects of NERI, is a center fully dedicated to numerical simulation, support of the research needs of the community, led by, at the time, by Professor Steve Mayen, who passed away and is such a great, long-standing name and recognized figure in earthquake engineering. There was a session for him at this ERI meeting. But at any rate, this is again one of the key components of NERI, new. And the other one is a post-event assessment of damage facility, or so-called RAP facility, which it has not been fully commissioned. It will be commissioned at the end of, sometime at the end of October, I suppose. And it will support the needs of those teams that are funded by NSF to go collect information after an event. It also has a cyber infrastructure. Its provider supports all the cyber infrastructure needs of NERI, Design Safe CI, and a network coordination office at Purdue University, the one I'm the PI for. That network coordination office has three responsibilities: leading community building. Our previous the plenary session speaker made a very important point to raise awareness, you have to build community. And one of the ways to build that community is to grow your own community, but you can do that and also expand that community to include others. That's one of the benefits of a multi-hazard approach to seismic resilience, as well as wind and other natural hazards. This slide shows you the current state of projects ongoing through NERI, as well as the facilities. On the left-hand column, you see the various facilities, the laboratories that have been funded and are active in NERI, and the number of projects, and also the utilization base in those facilities. You may see that some of those numbers are greater than the 250 or so days in a year, but that's because those facilities may have multiple components that can be utilized simultaneously, and so the numbers go up there as well. A point that I'd like to make, the UC San Diego, in case you went too fast before, is the large shake table facility, and naturally projects there take longer to execute and so forth. That's why the number is not comparable to the others, but you can see that the network in essence is busy. These are shared use projects, and that means that not all the projects are led by PIs from the facility. These are external users using those laboratories, and that's very important. It's anyone here that writes a proposal to pursue a specific answer to a research question in dealing with the resilience of our communities against earthquakes or windstorms. You may get funded and then get access to these facilities, which are funded by NSF at a very, your access will be at a very discounted price. Not so for other agencies, and that's the next column, which shows other federal agencies that fund this research at these laboratories. And finally, the last column, facilities also have the capability of entertaining their own projects, not funded by a federal agency or including NSF, during time that they have not allocated to their NERI work. And those are industry projects by and large, or some others. So you see there an example. The scheduling of all these projects is handled in a centralized way by the NCO, meaning each facility submits a request for testing, which is evaluated by the scheduler at the NCO, and then only after the process has been completed, it gets scheduled for testing. I'm going to conclude my presentation with a few slides from one of those facilities, Oregon State University, because I want to emphasize the multi-hazard nature of the research and the benefits that are accrued by that multi-hazard research. First of all, the community of researchers grows, and they may be looking at a common problem. And this particular facility offers an example of that. It's the Oregon State Coastal Wave Storm Surge and Tsunami Experimental Facility. And you see there the two components of that facility, a large wave flume and a directional wave basin. Another important aspect of NERI, which I should mention also, the research funded in NERI, the projects that I showed, do not come from a targeted NERI research program, like the NEAS research program. These are unsolicited proposals, which is how ECI, the new version of this Engineering for Natural Hazards and other sub-directors at NSF funds the work now. It's to unsolicited, no deadline, you can submit your proposal when you're ready, but there isn't a designated pot of money for it. So it's very important then that the facilities, and this was part of the competition, declare how they can be useful in addressing the problems of reducing the risk and the impact of these events. And that's through a science plan. Their science plan for Oregon State University was developed as a resource from those documents. One of the grand problems, challenges they found needed to be addressed was the effects of overland flow and waves and other coastal inundation hazards. Here's an example of the research that is ongoing at that facility. And in summary, the contributions from that facility to improving the resilience of our infrastructure. My last slide is to inform the community that NERI in its first year, also as a requirement from NSF, developed a 5-year science plan. This is available at DesignSafe CI, which is the portal for NERI in the cyber infrastructure. Please go register and you get access to many resources and tools. It doesn't cost any money, you just have to answer 3 or 4 questions. But another reason why I want to show you this, it's a resource for you. There are in it specific questions that need to be addressed to improve the resilience of our civil infrastructure, and appendices from each of the facilities that illustrate how that facility can help address those key questions and grand challenges. So I encourage you to read it and use it as a resource for your proposals. This plan is will be updated with a workshop, which is in the process of being funded sometime in March of next year, to incorporate the contribution of disruptive technologies to the problem of making our structures safer and more resilient against natural hazards. So please stay tuned, and we welcome your contribution. It's open for comment, so you can review it, send comments, and I hope it's helpful to you. Thank you.
And our third speaker, I love this, our speakers are right on time, so thank you. Thank you very much, because I always hate being the last speaker. So when the first speaker is used up all the time, and you got 5 minutes. So last speaker is Christy.
Okay, I think I can do it and keep you from not being too late to the break. So, as Lori said, I'm Christy Riccardi. I'm the Regional Director for the Office of Infrastructure Protection at DHS. A lot of words there. Basically, the office I work for is responsible for the protection and resilience of infrastructure, whether it be from natural hazards, man-made hazards, or cybersecurity. We're based up in Oakland, and I always appreciate when I see the Hayward Fault map, because I'm right at the red hottest part there in Oakland. It's a good reminder. It's a good reminder of what we're trying to do here. So today I'm going to talk about a few of the programs we do and how they apply to the earthquake community. Lori asked me to talk about the National Infrastructure Protection Plan, and when she first asked me that, I have to admit, I was like, oh, it's so boring. It's a document. Yes, it's a document, but it does really lay out a framework for how, as a community, as a nation, as regions, as states, locals, all on down, including with the private sector, we're going to protect infrastructure. And of course, as we've heard throughout this conference, certainly this morning, earthquakes, infrastructure, not necessarily the best combination. So making sure that that infrastructure is resilient, making sure that we are as prepared as we can be for when the inevitable happens, that's what the National Infrastructure Protection Plan lays out. So I'm going to walk us through that today, and then I'm going to highlight some of my favorite principles. It's a lovely document that you all can take to the beach this weekend or this summer. But I'm going to highlight my favorite principles and then bring them down together on how we're using those in a project locally in the Bay Area. So hopefully that makes some of the policy resonate. So the plan itself, it derives from Presidential Policy Directive 21, Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience. It's been published a few times, and I think that's meaning it's been updated. And I think that's relevant because what we've seen happen is the principles get matured, reinforced, and ultimately the framework somewhat proven itself that this is a principle that works. At the end of the day, like I said, I know this is just a document and it knows could be boring, but it really does lay out some of these principles, and I think a lot of those apply to all hazards, including earthquakes and other seismic activity. The authorship itself, how this comes together, embodies one of the most fundamental principles of the plan itself, and that's partnerships. So communities at all levels of government and with participation from across the private sector, which represents a lot of the owners and operators of our infrastructure, are who put this plan together. It describes a vision that is embodied in the mission of my department, but I think the mission of many of you here in this room, and that is that we want to see infrastructure that's secure and resilient. We want to look to reduce vulnerabilities. We want to minimize consequences. We want to identify threats, including the natural ones. And after that, we want to make sure we can respond and recover quickly when something does happen. You know, one thing I want you to keep in mind as we go through the next 10 minutes or so, when understanding the NIP, that natural disasters such as seismic activities, earthquakes, volcanoes, even mud pots. So that was a new one for me this week. Mud pots are a thing here in California, and those do have effects on our infrastructure. So these hazards are all part of what we're trying to do with this plan. So minimizing the impact of these natural hazards to infrastructure and working to ensure infrastructure can withstand the inevitable. That's what resilience is all about. And it's the intention of this doctrine to lay out at least DHS's approach, but also our partners' approach on how we're going to do this for many years. So just quickly, I think the definition of infrastructure is pretty well understood. Systems and assets, so vital that their debilitation or destruction would have an impact on our way of life, our national security. But I also want to talk about, you know, these days infrastructure at any level can have significance. So for example, what keeps a wastewater treatment plant open means a community of maybe 100,000 people is able to be safe and stay in their homes. The disruption of a dependence, whether that be energy, communication, Steve talked a little bit about this in his presentation too, transportation, could have a debilitating effect on that treatment plant and then ultimately have a massive disruption to our communities and to our businesses. So when we're looking at earthquake effects, you can, and then potentially the scale of the number of infrastructure that could be impacted really starts to put into perspective why it's so important that in steady state we're working so hard to make sure that infrastructure as prepared as possible for whatever the hazard may be, especially a hazard like a seismic event. So the NIP has a risk management approach, and you'll see throughout it that it's going to talk about natural threats, terrorism, cyber threats, and in each case, the threat has the potential to disrupt infrastructure. And of course, natural hazards includes earthquakes and seismic activities. So this is where these two concepts come together. The NIP's risk management framework it's fully encompassing of all hazards, and all the principles are there to lead to the same goals. So regardless of how the hazard, regardless of what the hazard is that threatens the infrastructure, we're looking to make sure that it's protected. So there are some differences in the details, of course, when we're looking at a cyber threat versus a terrorism threat versus a natural threat. There are some differences, but at the end of the day, in many cases, what we're doing to understand the infrastructure, understand the dependencies, is really hazard agnostic. And I think that's something that makes this really relevant to this community that may not have necessarily been understood in the past. So, what are the approaches? How are we going to get this done? One of my favorite principles, pinnacles of this is managing risk is partnerships. And I think this approach is immensely applicable to the earthquake community. And in fact, I'd argue this very room embodies the approach. The fact that we are here together from so many different types of organizations, coming together to talk about these issues, to learn from each other, that's a perfect example of how partnerships play into this. Certainly it's an overarching principle, and it manifests itself all over local and regional levels. The earthquake community has partnerships, of course, across all of these all of these categories. Planners, engineers, practitioners, building owners, operations, security professionals, emergency managers, we all must come together collectively to work on these issues. And I know this is a common sentiment. You cannot go to a conference where there are government people and not hear about public-private partnerships. But I think what's really interesting is these days, they're there and they're working and they're making a difference. So it's not just plans like this, but it's also the work we're doing at regional and local levels to understand each other's perspectives, whether it's the science, whether it's the emergency management, whether it's the community preparedness, that we're all coming to do that. And I'm going to talk about how the partnerships have manifested itself in the Bay Area in just a minute. I just wanted to mention that the best laid plans have a call to action, so it wasn't enough to just have a high-level strategic document that sat on the shelves in Washington, D.C. It's really important that any high-level policy document come with action, and so we'll get to that in just a second. These are the joint national priorities. I won't read them all, but there are some of the things that out of this past National Infrastructure Protection Plan, the communities came together to agree on what they were going to focus on. And I think you can see across all of these different approaches where preparedness, planning, mitigation for earthquakes comes into play as well. So kind of getting to the much more interesting part. So how does this all come together? So we've got a National Infrastructure Protection Plan. It lays out things like partnerships, information sharing, analysis, understanding interdependencies and dependencies. And it puts together a framework where we're looking at risks from all different vectors. And like I said, what we're talking about here today are the natural hazard ones. So what we've done at DHS is bring that down at a regional level. And we have a program called the Regional Resilience Assessment Program, or the RAP. We do these all over the country, but there's one going on in the Bay Area right now that I'm particularly proud of. We're looking at the utilities in the nine counties around the Bay and trying to understand their interdependencies and dependencies. And when I actually first came to the region, this project was already underway. And I was a little surprised. I was like, don't we know that? I mean, don't we know how the water is connected to the energy, is connected to the wastewater, is connected to the communications? And you know, it turns out we do in many respects, but it's actually quite complicated, and there doesn't exist necessarily a common operating picture. By understanding, the goal is, by understanding the interdependencies and dependencies, we can predict what's going to happen. And that's where actually using the Hayward fault modeling, the Haywired modeling, to understand if there's a disruption to a node over here, what does that mean? What does that mean for this wastewater treatment plant? I mentioned that earlier. What does that mean for the water distribution in the 9 Bay area? So this project, as I promised, it embodies the principles of the NIP kind of in real life. So how we do these, and this is true of all our apps, but I'll talk specifically about this one. We're going to bring together federal, state, local, community participation. So in this case, that's going to be FEMA, that's going to be the state of California, that's going to be the Bay Area Association of Governments. We're going to come together and decide on what we want to talk about, what we want to study. Then we're going to bring in, whether it's the utility owners and operators or other infrastructure partners, to start talking about what do we know, getting the information. So information sharing ends up manifesting itself in a couple ways in this project. So it's certainly information on how, my system, this is the data from my system and this is where I know it connects to. These are the requirements my other system has and your system, that type of stuff. That's not easy, but it's because of the partnerships that people are willing to share that kind of information. The other way that information sharing comes into play, and then the partnership again begins to manifest itself, is when we start to see the results of this. So just to visualize, I know this is very small, and there aren't labels on here yet, but when we start to look at, this is just the water and the wastewater system, and they've started to overlay the energy pieces. So this project, I should have mentioned, is about halfway through. They've started collecting all the data, and now they're starting to model it. And what the idea is you could looking at overlaying the Hayward fault modeling data, understand where a disruption might happen with one of these nodes, and then see in real time how that will affect the rest of the infrastructure. This will certainly also be accompanied by characteristics, understanding in a more textual format, but this is also an opportunity to visualize it. So let me just make sure I didn't miss anything else about that. Yeah, so we will use subway maps is what we're calling these, and I actually was a little confused about that we were studying the BART, and we're actually not. It's just a way to visualize this so we can turn on and off what we're looking at. So again, an example of how we're able to take partnerships, information sharing, analysis, interdependencies on infrastructure, look at that in an earthquake scenario, and start planning. So what the result of this project, the idea would be, and we could do these in other settings as well, is it should inform our emergency management plans, it should inform our investment decisions, it should help the individual utilities understand where they need to be redundant. One interesting thing, and this isn't a live demo, when you're flipping some of the nodes, you see the impact is pretty acute, right? So if we take this one node out, this entire part of the Bay Area is going to lose water, or is going to lose wastewater, which are, of course, very devastating things that could happen to a community. But in other cases, we can see, like, actually, these 3 nodes could go out, and we're still able to largely continue to function. That's the type of resilience we want to get to. So by having this analysis, we're able to help those that are responsible for the infrastructure make those informed decisions and invest wisely. So with that, Lori, that's what I got.
Christy wins the award. We have 1 minute and 45 seconds still left on her presentation time. So that does give us some time for questions, which I'd like to open it up to. I see one hand here, other hands, just so I can get a cue. There's one over there. We're bringing a mic.
Thank you very much. Very good presentation. Question on this figure. You mentioned that they are doing the study. Is it internally DHS, FEMA, USGS? Who's doing this?